Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dave Maxwell, who is a retired U.S. Army Special Operations Colonel and has spent more than 30 years in Asia as a practitioner and specializes in North Korea and East Asia security affairs and irregular, unconventional, and political warfare. He is the editor of the Small Wars Journal. He is a senior fellow at the Foundations for Defense of Democracies, a senior fellow at the Global Peace Foundation, where he focuses on a free and unified Korea, and a senior advisor to the Center for Asia Pacific Strategy. Dave Maxwell, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you, John. Great to be here. I'm really happy to be part of this podcast and the work that the Information Professionals Association does. So thank you.
Yeah, well, it's great having you, Dave. And you're going to be the first guest with whom we've had a deep dive about North Korea-related matters. So that's what we'd like to talk to you about today. But before we do that, do you think we could get your perspective on where we are today with respect to our strategic landscape?
Yeah, well, I think our national security strategy and national defense strategy lay it out pretty well, and even going back to our 2017 national security strategy. And I think we really need to be focused on what the Department of Defense calls today the pacing item of China. But China and Russia are the revisionist powers, and Iran and North Korea are the rogue powers. And I also call them revolutionary and rogue powers, since both countries consider themselves revolutionary powers. And so we've got these four major countries, and then of course we still have violent extremist organizations. And so the landscape is the United States is faced with myriad threats around the world, and we are. We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Certainly Ukraine is consuming a lot of energy and a lot of resources. Certainly the Taiwan situation, the potential for conflict in Asia consumes a lot of attention. Iran on its path to nuclear weapons, threat to Israel in the region, and of course North Korea. North Korea is always comes in last, and often you will hear China, Russia, and Iran, and then sometimes North Korea. And I would just make this quick plug that North Korea is connected to all those three countries, as well as extremist organizations in conflict areas in the Middle East and in Africa, where it proliferates weapons, either directly to conflict areas or indirectly, mostly through Iran to, say, Yemen. Many of the Scud missiles, originally come from North Korea. So it is connected. And this little peninsula, the Korean Peninsula, very small geographically, has reach around the world. Both the illicit activities of North Korea, but also South Korea growing as a partner in the arsenal of democracy. It is now one of the major defense, has a very large defense industry, recently selling about $40 billion worth of equipment to Poland, as an example. So both North Korea and South Korea have global reach and global influence, but of course in very different ways. So that's kind of how I see the landscape and the Korean Peninsula fitting into the global situation.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you've already mentioned China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. What would you say are some of the similarities between these nation states, and then what are some of the key differences?
Yeah, so I think that's really important, and I think when you sum it up in the most basic equation, we have democratic countries versus authoritarian countries, and I think the revisionist and rogue powers, all four of them, are authoritarian governments with closed societies. And so I think there are the three major powers in the world: the revisionist powers, the rogue revolutionary powers, and then open societies, the modern nation states, of which the United States is the leading one. And the difference is that the revisionist and rogue powers really attack the international nation state system, the rules based order, to try to either destroy it or make it function in their interests at the expense of the like-minded democracies. Whereas the open societies seek to protect the international nation-state system, the rules-based international order. And we see, the United States heavily emphasize that, but also our allies, whether it's NATO and the European Union. But Japan just released a strategy that emphasizes the rules-based international order. South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy, they just released last month, doesn't mention China except for 2 times, but it mentions protection of the rules-based international order, which is certainly a code word for its competition with China. But what I'd really like to say is that the difference between these closed and open societies really can be looked at from a Clausewitzian perspective. And we look at Clausewitz as saying that war is a continuation of politics by other means. But for our adversaries, politics is war by other means. As Mao said, war is politics with bloodshed, and politics is war without bloodshed. And really what this comes down to is it's an ideological war that we are competing, going back to democracy versus authoritarianism. And what's really important in this is that the United States, we've long led with kinetic operations. I think that the idea of integrated deterrence that our Department of Defense is pushing is to try to bring in the other instruments of national power other than the military. And of course, a key one is information and influence. And I think our adversaries, what we see happening is that they are leading with influence. They are leading with trying to shape the information environment and influence target audiences around the world. Whereas we tend to think of the employment of military force, or we have, for the last 20 years. And so I think our national defense strategy and our national security strategy is really trying to, one is lead with allies, and we put a great amount of pressure or emphasis on building our alliances. But I think in order to compete in strategic competition, which is how we call it, in the gray zone, in that space between peace and war, below the threshold of conflict, you've really got to lead with influence. And I think integrated deterrence is a call to the rest of the interagency and to use all the instruments of power, but I think especially the information influence or instrument of power to really support our strategic objectives.
Yeah, short little sidebar on that. I've seen at least one email come out of the US DoD, which used the term integrated influence, not instead of, but in addition to integrated deterrence, which I think there might be something to that. But before we get too much into information, I want to just ask you a quick follow-up question about those 4 countries. Is there any evidence, unclassified, obviously, that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are collaborating at all to pursue their various agendas, or is it more like any perceived collaboration is really just coincidental? What do you think about that?
Well, I think there's a multitude of evidence of North Korea, Iran cooperation, and I think on arms, on missile development, perhaps there is on nuclear, but I'm not aware of any reports directly accusing, but certainly missiles. And of course, there's been direct evidence of North Korean support to Syria on nuclear development. We're thankful for Israel for destroying Assad's nuclear program in Syria in 2007. And so there's that kind of connectivity as well. Of course, we are also seeing the reports of North Korea providing artillery rounds to Russia. And of course, North Korea has been supportive of Putin's war in Ukraine diplomatically. I mean, they've been speaking out. They just criticized the U.S. for sending tanks, or announcing that we're going to send tanks to Ukraine, and so there's been that kind of Russian support from North Korea. And of course, China and North Korea are allies, the only two allies that each other have. They're allied with no other countries. And so there is that. Although I think many people incorrectly assume that China can control North Korea. One of the things about North Korea, its history, is that it has played every friend, partner, or adversary off against each other. I mean, starting with the Korean War, how Kim Il sung played Mao and Stalin off of each other for the decision to go to war. Certainly, Mao is still, China, the CCP is still upset because Mao probably would have gone to Taiwan. If you remember in 1950, when North Korea attacked South Korea, the first action that the U.S. took was to send the Seventh Fleet to the Taiwan Strait because we feared that the People's Liberation Army would mount an attack on Taiwan. And of course, by Kim Il sung attacking South Korea, that forced Mao to delay those plans and ultimately shelve them because they had to be concerned with the U.S. and the UN command on its northeastern flank there. So there is no love between China and North Korea, and the relationship I really describe as well. One is China has the three no's. They don't want war on the peninsula, no war, no instability, and no nuclear weapons. So they're a pretty good baseball team. They're batting 600 because they failed on the nuclear weapons aspect. But China's relationship, I use this analogy that China is like a lifeguard and North Korea is a drowning child. And China will throw out the life ring to keep North Korea's head above water, but it will not pull it into safety. And what we see over decades now is that China has been like a barometer. As international food aid increases, China's will decrease. As international food aid decreases, China's will increase. But they are not providing the equipment, the military equipment in any kind of capacity that would help North Korea to develop the capabilities to go to war. Now, nuclear weapons, that's a different story. North Korea is developing nuclear weapons, missiles, missile capabilities, but its military, of course, has obsolete, Soviet-based equipment, and the 1.2 million active duty soldiers are suffering because of the failed economy in the North. And in fact, the current winter training cycle that takes place from Thanksgiving until March, as they try to bring their forces to the highest state of readiness, there are reports that entire units have had to stop training because of lack of food. And so, this is why I think that the regime invests so heavily in nuclear weapons and missiles to be able to counter for its conventional weaknesses.
I see. Maybe we could start stepping a little bit more into the way North Korea views information and use information. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. First and foremost, information is really key to the regime. It's key to controlling the population internally, and it's key to influence externally. And so the regime has to paint the picture that it is under threat, because that is what justifies the sacrifice and suffering of the Korean people in the North. And I think it's really important as we talk about this. We should think about the question that Dr. Jung Pak, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia Pacific, and the Deputy to Ambassador Sung Kim, who is our Special Envoy for North Korean negotiations. She often asks, who does Kim Jong-un fear the most, the U.S. military or the Korean people living in the North? And the answer is, it's the Korean people living in the North, because they have designed their entire system, Songbun, this social control system, 51 classes of society. They've designed this to be able to prevent any kind of resistance or collective action by the people. And so they are more afraid of the Korean people but they're most afraid of the Korean people when they are armed with information and understanding of the outside world. And we can see time and time again how North Korea tries to coerce South Korea into preventing information from going into North Korea. In June of 2020, Kim Yo Jong, who is the sister of Kim Jong Un, she threatened South Korea because of the defectors, the escapees who were launching balloons into North Korea, carrying thumb drives and money and leaflets and things. But the thumb drives with electronic information are really key. And she threatened to blow up the South Korean liaison building in Kaesong. Kaesong is the city in North Korea where South Korea established the Kaesong Industrial Complex years ago as part of economic engagement. And she threatened to blow up the building, and then she did blow up the building. It was destroyed, and then by December of 2020, South Korea passed the anti-leaflet law to prevent information going from South Korea into North Korea, ostensibly because of the threat from North Korea, and that they justified it by trying to protect the frontline civilian population from a North Korean response. And so they made it illegal. That was an action by the last Korean administration, not the current one, that actually provided support, aid, and comfort to the Kim family regime by trying to prevent information from going into North Korea. And that's really an example of how much the regime fears information from the outside world. So that's one aspect of information. Of course, there's propaganda and agitation.
Do you think I could ask you just like a quick little follow-up? I mean, this is, I just cluing in on something that some people might be like, that wasn't the most important thing Dave was just talking about. But I was really curious when you said there's 51 different subsections of the population.
Yes. So this Songbun, yeah, that's a very important question, and I'm glad you asked it because there are 51 classes of society. This Songbun system is where every citizen's background is evaluated and assessed, and so there's 51 classes, but they're basically in three broad classes: the elite, obvious, surrounding the regime in Pyongyang; the wavering class, that's really the middle section, and that's most people in the military and the security services. And then you have the disloyal class, that's the bottom third. And those are the ones who are a threat to the regime. Anybody who came from South Korea, including the 78,000 prisoners of war from South Korea that were just left in North Korea. North Korea refused to return them. They use those 78,000 prisoners as slave labor. They work in the mines, or they did work in the mines. Most of them have passed away. But in 1956, they allowed them to become North Korean citizens, but they were made in class 43. 43 Lee was the designation, meaning they came from South Korea. So they were always disloyal, but they allowed them to marry. The problem is that they married women from North Korea, and those women immediately became that class of society, and their children became that class of society. And one of them, who later escaped, asked the question of his parents, "Why did you even have me?" Because the only job that children can do is to work in the mines. And so what they did, they used these prisoners from South Korea and put them in the lowest class, and all they can do is work in slave labor conditions, mostly mining. And so they've actually created a perpetual slave class, and that will just continue on to do that slave labor for them. And that's in addition to the gulags and the other all the other atrocities that are being committed. So these classes of society are meant to control the population, and as a person comes up to his 17th year, that's when they are evaluated. But it's all connected to the family, all connected to those who've owned land before the war. And once you are in this system, there's no upward mobility, no way to better your life, and so it's really just a terrible, terrible atrocity against 25 million Korean people living in the north.
Yeah, well, you preempted one of my other follow-on questions. Is like, is there any way to advance, may not be the right word, matriculate, to get into some of the more favored classes? And it sounds like the answer
There,
is no.
there
And
is
yeah.
there is some merit, though. Some people are identified as having skills, and they will develop into cyber, or they're nuclear technicians and scientists, those supporting the nuclear program. However, you would think that those people who are developing the nuclear program are are well taken care of. They are stranded, living in the towns around Yongbyon where the nuclear power plant is and the nuclear development testing goes on. They can't leave there, and they have to import women for them to marry. And the problem is they are all exposed to radiation, and their children of these scientists and their imported wives who are forced to marry to keep them happy. Their children are often born with terrible birth defects because of the radiation exposure. So even if your life is bettered because you have some kind of capability based on identified merit that the regime needs, you don't really ever rise to any kind of certainly not to a leadership position. Any leaders in the regime are all connected to um, the regime elite, and that is the that Kim Il Sung was the head of a guerrilla unit during World War II in the Soviet Far East. He commanded the first of the 88th Special Independent Sniper Brigade, and he built the myth that North Korea was liberated by Kim Il Sung's guerrilla actions against the Japanese. So anti-Japanese partisan warfare is the foundation for the regime, and which is why I call the North Korea the guerrilla dynasty and gulag state. Adrian Buzo from Australia wrote a book calling North Korea the guerrilla dynasty. So I borrow that name from him. But the gulag state because of all the prison camps that exist. But actually, the entire country of North Korea is like a prison camp. And so life is just really, really difficult inside North Korea. And
Mm,
there's just no prospect that it will ever get better under the leadership of the Kim family regime or the
mm.
mafia-like crime family cult that it is.
Right. Um, I think I keep getting us a little further astray, but uh, why is North Korea referred to as the Hermit Kingdom frequently?
Because of isolation, although sometimes I think yeah, North Korea is often called the Hermit Kingdom. Actually, all of Korea at one point was the Hermit Kingdom. Isolated, much like Japan. Throughout history, but North Korea was always the the transit of armies from China, Russia, Mongolia, and of course from Japan to the mainland. The Korean Peninsula looks like a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan, and it is also the transit point for the Japanese army to go to the mainland. So, 5,000 years of history in Korea. It's one that has their ground has been trampled by armies
Mm,
for thousands of years. So,
I
um,
see. Yeah,
but yeah, so that's why it's called the Hermit Kingdom.
I see. Okay, so I think I short circuited a question I asked 5 minutes ago about how does North Korea view information, work with information, and so you articulated how they use information in order to help control their population, and you told a story about how they influenced South Korea with that episode that got South Korea to capitulate with not sending leaflet drops and stuff like that over
Yes, yeah,
anymore.
the balloons
Um,
and
yeah, are there any other examples that
yeah,
are like the North Korea brand of information operations or something?
yeah. So the propaganda and agitation department is really the media for North Korea. You have the Korean Central News Agency and and various entities but it's all controlled by the propaganda and agitation department. And so they're very strict on their messaging. And they, of course, they will tell lies. But externally, they're trying to set the conditions to support their political warfare strategy and their blackmail diplomacy strategy. Their political warfare strategy is all about undermining, and conducting subversion against South Korea. And it is also about undermining the U.S. South Korea alliance with the intent to drive U.S. forces off the Korean Peninsula. And so they focus on many different issues, as in attacking the United Nations command, its legitimacy. They attack the alliance in many, many ways. And they have two organizations that are really important to understand. The United Front Department, which, like all communist countries, is charged with undermining South Korea and dealing with the external relations, and the Cultural Exchange Bureau, which used to be called the 225th Bureau. And this organization, it conducts covert action in South Korea, establishing underground political parties and recruiting sympathizers and recruiting those in South Korea who would foment unrest and revolution. And so the intent is to subvert the confidence of the Korean people in their own government, the people in South Korea. And they use broadcasts, they use leaflets, they use social media, they use cyber activities, and useful idiots. As we all know, there are many people in South Korea that look to North Korea as a place to emulate.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I've actually wanted to have a podcast episode dedicated to the concept of useful idiots. So maybe we'll just get a little primer here. So yeah, please proceed.
So a problem that South Korea created for itself is its own national security law. And so its national security law is designed to prevent information from North Korea coming into the South. And so, as one example, when I was in the 80s and my wife, who was from Korea, had an apartment in Munsan, which is close to the DMZ. And I was there and I was flipping through TV channels and I got a broadcast from North Korea. And so I started watching it. My wife said, "You can't watch that. It's against the law." And I said, "Come on, this is a free country." And she said, "It's against the law." And it is, and it still is against the law. And what they tried to do is to prevent influence from North Korea into South Korea. And of course, espionage and other things as well, but general information. And to the point where the Koreans in the South don't study about North Korea. They have, I was at a lecture this week at the Marine Corps Command and Staff College giving a lecture, and there was a Korean Marine there who wanted to take the lecture because he admitted that he didn't really have as good understanding of North Korea that he thought he should, because they never studied it in school. Unless you're in the intelligence community or in a think tank belonging to the government, they really don't study North Korea. And so because of this national security law. Now, South Korea is just now lifting those restrictions. And they are going to, for the first time, going to allow North Korean broadcasts into South Korea. And of course, the conservatives don't like that at all because they're afraid that it will influence people. And I had this discussion with Ambassador Lee Shin-hwa. She is the South Korean ambassador for North Korean human rights. And when she first came to visit this summer, we were able to have lunch. And I asked her, I gave her my view. I said, "This is good." I said, because now South Korea can have the moral high ground by sending information into North Korea because they allow North Korea's information coming into the South. She said that, well, she didn't think it was a good idea because people would be influenced. And my response is, if you watch North Korea propaganda, they have one broadcaster, this woman who does all the broadcasting. She's famous. She's been broadcasting for decades. She's the main broadcaster, and she just about yells as she's giving the broadcast. And the information is so obviously propaganda that what I believe will happen is that people will first, they'll want to watch it, they'll want to see it, then they will quickly, see through it, and they will satirize it, and then they'll become bored with it, and it will have no real influence. And the point I always make to my Korean counterparts is that the national security law, it makes especially young people, it makes them curious. When you're not allowed to do something, it makes you curious about what it is that you're prevented from doing. And of course, this had a big impact during the democracy movement in the 80s. Um, many college students and many people, since they weren't allowed to study North Korea or learn about it, they became enamored with it, and they did take on much of the myths. That it's the socialist workers' paradise, that they have complete freedom in the North, and that they, free medical care for all, and all these good things that comes through in their propaganda. People believe that, and most importantly, they believed that North Korea, with this Juche ideology, which is basically one of self-reliance, its general translation, that is North Korea that has stood up to all the rest of the world. It has remained independent. And in fact, in the 1980s, The Economist did a surreptitious survey asking Koreans in the North how many countries there are in the world. And the answer was five. There are five countries in the world: Russia, China, the United States, and North Korea, and Japan and North Korea. So and all the other countries that exist are puppets of those of China, Russia, the United States, and Japan, to include South Korea. And it's only North Korea that has remained its independence, its revolutionary spirit, and has stood up to the outside world. And that's the narrative that they tell the Korean people. And so that is the kind of information control that exists. And of course, people look at that, and romanticize that from the outside. Those who don't have knowledge of the North, and they look at these ideas, and they say, "Wow, North Korea has really maintained its independence," and so it attracts people, and some people, become true believers, and then others become useful idiots, and there are many that, for whatever reason, will carry the water of North Korea based on not wanting to directly support North Korea, but because they would rather blame South Korea and the United States for the problems. Many people will say that it is the presence of the United States military that prevents unification, and that is the one that is standing in the way to peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. But of course, the removal of U.S. troops would likely lead to conflict, because Kim Jong-un is bent on completing the revolution, which means attacking South Korea to unify it by force under Northern domination.
Mm. We had a while back, I'll put a link in the show notes, a great conversation with United States Ambassador Roger Carstens, who leads the State Department's hostage negotiation efforts.
I know
And
Roger.
oh,
Yeah,
you
we
do?
were both
Great.
special forces officers. Yes,
Is
I
that
know.
right? Yeah, yeah, great. Great discussion. One of the things that came out during our chat was the way China and Russia, and I'm curious if North Korea falls into the same category of using the current international rules-based system, basically weaponizes our norms so that they can assert to the world or to various different audiences, hey, we're just playing by the rules here, but they're really just subverting and not playing by the rules. Do you kind of get what I'm asking there?
Yes, and I think one area, of course, is the United Nations. Of course,
Yeah.
the North Korea um, has a mission to the United Nations. They're a member of the United Nations, so they're actually North Korean diplomats in New York. They have in fact, where their consulate is in New York City. New York City is renaming that street to Otto Warmbier Street, in recognition of Otto Warmbier being tortured and murdered by the North Koreans. So they got to put Otto Warmbier on their mailing address. So that's one good piece of influence operation there. But
do you think, Dave, you could just tell that story real fast for those who might
sure,
not be?
Otto Warmbier was a student at the University of Virginia, adventurous young man, and took a trip to North Korea. Wanted to, do something different and unique. And he traveled there with a tourist company. And then it was alleged that they were leaving, that he stole a propaganda poster. He wanted to take a propaganda poster with him, and so they of course arrested him, and they tried him, and they convicted him and sentenced him to hard labor. They made him um, they made him apologize publicly. You probably remember the show trial that they gave. It was obvious that he was coerced, but interestingly, um, from that point on, they never showed anything again because he never cooperated. And it wasn't until 2018 that they released him after we negotiated. And when they went to pick him up, we sent a plane there to pick him up and bring him home, and he was in a coma. And so he died about a week later after he got back to the United States. He'd been brutally tortured, no teeth left, and he was just a terrible, terrible situation. And so he was tortured and murdered, and except for the show trial, they could get nothing else out of him for propaganda use because he refused to cooperate, and we think that likely led to his death through torture.
Yeah.
So that's
this was the 2016-ish time period, something along those lines, maybe.
2018.
Yeah.
2018, right before the Singapore summit. I'm sorry, 2017, before that. Now, what is really interesting in this National Defense Authorization Act of 2023 is the Otto Warmbier Act that was actually drafted in 2021, but has now been approved in this NDA, which is all about countering information surveillance in North Korea. And so Congress has authorized another $40 million for Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, to broadcast into North Korea, which they do. They do some great work, and they are also providing resources for state to provide grants to non-governmental organizations with the idea to try to break down the wall, penetrate the wall of that tries to keep out information and to get information into the Korean people, and primarily human rights and the like there. So that's there's actually some good movement that and a recognition of how important information is into the North. It's long been neglected. We often say that the Chinese saying, "When is the best time to plant a tree?" And 20 years ago. And when is the next best time? Right now. And of course, that applies perfectly to information. If you want to have effects, you got to think long term. You can't turn on an information operation and have an effect right now. It takes at least weeks, months, and often years. And some of the things that we have talked about for decades. It would have been nice to be doing what we're starting to do now 20 years ago. We might see some effects. Things might be in a different condition, different situation right now had we started with some of these initiatives 20 years ago. So, but the second best time is right now, and I'm glad to see people are taking the initiative to start trying to effectively use information against North Korea.
So famously, Dave, President Trump a few years ago engaged personally with North Korea, which really challenged some of the U.S. diplomacy norms at the time. How do you characterize the current U.S. state of engagement with North Korea, and especially as it relates to information?
Yeah, so the current administration broadly has stated multiple times that it is ready to negotiate anytime, anywhere without preconditions. But it is North Korea that really has the preconditions. And North Korea, we have seen for decades that they will use tensions, increased threats, and provocations to gain political and economic concessions. There is one concession that they really demand, and that is relief of sanctions. And of course, the sanctions were really imposed in 2017 during the Fire and Fury time, and when North Korea tested an ICBM and made its sixth nuclear weapons test. And so that was really a key point in time. By 2018, things had changed with the Olympics in Pyeongchang in South Korea, kind of rapprochement there. The first meeting between President Moon and Kim Jong-un in Panmunjom in April, and then the meeting with President Trump and Kim Jong-un in Singapore in June of 2018. And then a later meeting between President Moon and Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang in 2018. So all of that happened in 2018. I remember being at a meeting with the new special representative and later Deputy Secretary of State Steve Biegun, and he commented that as he studied the problem, all things have been tried with North Korea, and all we can do is repackage. Well, what President Trump did was the last thing that had ever been done. Was direct high-level engagement. We've tried that. He gave it his best shot, and Kim Jong-un, would not negotiate as a responsible member of the international community. And so we've tried everything. And what is important, though, and I credit President Trump and President Moon, and I credit President Biden and President Yoon, the sanctions that were imposed in 2017 have not been lifted. And South Korea and the United States has not wavered in the lifting of sanctions. Many will say that lifting of sanctions is prerequisite and that we should lift sanctions. Well, we've done that in the past. We made many concessions in the past, and North Korea may come to the negotiating table, may make an agreement, and then they'll break the agreement. What is important to understand about the sanctions, and despite the fact that China and Russia are complicit in helping North Korea evade sanctions, they're not working as effectively as they could be because now China and Russia do not support them, even though they voted for them in 2017 because of the situation. Was so tense at the time. But the fact is that Kim Jong-un promised, we think, the military elite and the regime party elite that he would be able to play President Trump and President Moon, and that he would get sanctions relief. And he's failed to do so. And talking to some escapees, defectors, they say that this is one of the biggest failures of the regime in the last 7 decades, the failure to get sanctions relief. And so this is important for maintaining pressure on North Korea. Now, as I said, both administrations, Biden and Yoon, are willing to negotiate, but it is Kim Jong-un, and it is Kim Jong-un that is really the problem here, because he will not negotiate, and he prioritizes his nuclear weapons and missile programs over the welfare of the people. And this is why we really need to flip things on its head. The conventional wisdom is denuclearize first, and then unification can happen. In 1953, at the armistice, the military commanders in paragraph 60 said that the political leaders need to solve the problem on Korea, and that's the Korea question. The Korea question is the unnatural division of the peninsula. They said within 90 days of the armistice, the political leaders should come together and solve that. They haven't. And so the armistice actually calls for unification. And so, but we have long focused on the nuclear problem, not on the bigger problem. And so what we are advocating in a working group led by Ambassador Robert Joseph is a new strategy that focuses on human rights up front, an information and influence campaign, holistic and sophisticated, and the pursuit of a free and unified Korea. We didn't talk about human rights, and they are really important because not only are human rights a moral imperative, they're a national security issue, and they're inextricably linked to information and influence. And just to give you one example, whenever we talk about the nuclear program and the missile program, it reinforces legitimacy of Kim Jong-un. The Propaganda and Agitation Department uses that to show the Korean people in the North that we fear Kim Jong-un because of his nuclear weapons. However, when we talk about human rights, then that undermines his legitimacy. And of course, that gives hope to the people inside North Korea. And so one thing that we should be doing as part of an information influence campaign is every time we have to address a nuclear program, we need to address human rights simultaneously, just as Ronald Reagan did with Gorbachev. Tear down this wall. Against all advice, he continued to press human rights, and we need to do that now. And so we need to say, when he tests his missiles, we need to say that, they spent $170 million on testing missiles, money that could go to feeding the people inside North Korea. Those are the things that need to be part of our messaging to the Korean people in the North. And so human rights is something that we really need to focus on. And then ultimately, we focus first on unification, then on denuclearization, because it is only through unification, the establishment of a secure, stable, economically vibrant, non-nuclear Korean Peninsula established under a liberal constitutional form of government, is the only way we're going to see an end to the crimes against humanity and the nuclear program. We need to see and work towards helping our Korean allies establish a united Republic of Korea. UROK is the acronym, which you could pronounce as "You Rock." So, so that's really I just offer that our new strategy, but it really integrates human rights, information, and the pursuit of a free and unified Korea, resting on the absolute foundation of deterrence and defense. And what we've seen in the last 2 years is a revitalization of the military capabilities of the Combined Forces Command, revitalization of exercises and military action preparation to deter war, and if deterrence fails, to defend South Korea.
Right. Wow. You said a lot there, Dave. And I should have mentioned this up at the top, but you and some colleagues just put out a extensive recap, I think, of everything that you were just talking about. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, yes. I worked hard on that, and so I mean it was authored by Ambassador Robert Joseph, but we all contributed to it, and I align with everything that we put in there. And I've been long advocating human rights up front, influence campaign, and pursuit of a free and unified Korea, resting on a foundation of deterrence and defense. That
Yeah.
is really the way forward.
Yeah, and for the listeners that are still with us here, and I imagine everybody is, this has been riveting. There's a link in the show notes to this. You are calling it the National Strategy for Countering North Korea, and this is put out by the National Institute for Public Policy. Dave Maxwell, Robert Joseph, Robert Collins, and several other co-authors. Must read kind of a piece for those who are interested in this whole discussion space. Would like to start closing out, if I may, Dave. So do you have a research question or two that you might offer up that a student can take a crack at?
Yeah, so some of the things that I think really need to be focused on is how can we develop the technologies that can maximize our information capabilities to penetrate North Korea? There are 7.5 million smartphones inside North Korea, so we need to figure out a technological way to be able to access that. So I think that's one area. I think we have to. Another one is mapping out the potential succession. That I think is something that everyone focuses on. Is his sister going to succeed him, half brother, or his daughter, which we saw at the ICBM launch in November? He rolled out his 11-year-old daughter there, and people are speculating on that. So that's an area that really needs to be researched. I think mapping out the entire human terrain inside North Korea, particularly the the key personalities and key communicators. I think I would really like to see people focus on the escapee or defector community to identify key communicators who can really be the bridge between North and South, and how to use. I mean, the question would be, how can we use escapees to the best ability to support the unification process? I think that's really worth exploring there.
Right, for sure. And then finally, what are one of your go-to books for people to check out if they're maybe not familiar with North Korea, or what kind of book suggestion might you have?
Well, instead of a book suggestion, the reports at the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, where I'm a board member, talk extensively about Songbun. Robert Collins wrote the best report on that, but also on information. There's a number of reports. George Hutchison just wrote a report. I mean, a couple hundred pages. It's a book on the influence of leaflets and loudspeakers on the frontline military. So that's a very information based report. Martin Williams has written extensive reporting on technology in North Korea. And as I mentioned, smartphones and the like there, and the use of their intranet, their internal cyber capabilities. So that those are important books. I mentioned Dr. Jung Pak. She wrote a biography of Kim Jong Un, Becoming Kim Jong Un. That's really a key book. And but for the general audience, and a book I recommend to people going to Korea is one by Kong Dong Oh and her husband Ralph Hassig, and it is the new book on. Um, uh, it is just a short book on North Korea, just published 2 years ago now, and it is it really combines a history with the current makeup of the society, and they really have done a fantastic job in a very readable way to understand many of the problems that I've talked about from the historical perspective and the political perspective that exists today. And KDO, Kong Dong O's work results from her being on the Chinese border with North Korea, interviewing escapees as they left, and Koreans from the North who transit back and forth conducting trade prior to COVID.
Oh, my goodness. Well, you have certainly given us a lot to think about. And with that, Dave Maxwell, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you. My honor.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.